The year was 1993. The monumental success of Nevermind by Nirvana 2 years prior had sent major labels into overdrive. They were all scrambling for the next Nirvana, which meant signing any obscure or underground band that resembled anything heavy, underground or edgy. One of these new label signees would be Melvins, who were signed to Atlantic Records in 1993. Melvins were unique amongst the sea of grunge and alternative bands in the fact that they were actually Kurt Cobain's favourite band, with Cobain even spending many of his years prior to Nirvana following around Melvins on their various tours and being the scrawniest roadie in the history of rock music. This sudden boom in success and mainstream attention led to Cobain working on the Melvins' major label debut Houdini as a producer. It seemed like a perfect match. Cobain was a huge fan of the music, and Melvins could only benefit from having Cobain as a credit on the album. Unfortunately, the outcome would end up chaotic, leading to Cobain eventually being fired from the project entirely due to his various demons and inability to actually put in a day's work. Despite the rough recording of Houdini, Cobain and the various members of Melvins had been friends for a very long time, with Melvins frontman Buzz Osborne meeting Cobain through their art and electronics class at school. Despite being interested in music his entire life, beginning to sing at the age of 2, Cobain was unaware of any punk or hardcore music at the time, with Osborne beginning to lend Cobain old records and magazines. Cobain's obsession with punk and underground music would build as Osborne's newly formed band Melvins began playing more hardcore punk music. Melvins would form in 1983, with the band name being inspired by the unusual name of the supervisor at the Thriftway where Osborne worked at the time. Longtime drummer Dale Crover would join in 1984 after being yoinked from an Iron Maiden cover band. Melvins focused on playing fast-paced hardcore punk. This was until they got bored of playing ridiculously quick and decided to play noticeably slower and heavier than any other band at the time. Although the band were incredibly unique, they didn't see much popularity at first, commonly playing shows to crowds that consisted of single digits. The highlight would be the band's first tour, which involved them supporting the band RKL, who were only able to afford the tour because they had recently broken into a skate shop and were selling off stolen skate parts to any skate shop they passed by on tour. Although Melvins weren't too popular amongst nationwide music fans, Cobain was obsessed, with his journal that for some reason has been released to the public, noting how Melvins' first show had a huge impact on him and his creation of future music. This said show was actually in front of the Thriftway store that housed the supervisor who inspired the name. Cobain would become obsessed with more underground music around this time. This inspired him to start creating music himself, eventually dropping out of high school to form the band Fecal Matter alongside Melvins' drummer Dale Crover, who played both bass and drums for the band. The band released one demo named Illiteracy Will Prevail. Upon listening to this demo, making a connection between the vocal style on the project and what Cobain would later become known for is very difficult. Crover would reveal that this was actually due to Cobain being sick throughout the entirety of the demo's recording. I'd assume that was due to Cobain's lifestyle at the time. This involved him being homeless and repeatedly passing out drunk on Crover's back porch. Although Fecal Matter received a small amount of local attention, mainly because this drunk weirdo wouldn't stop giving out tapes to people, it didn't lead Cobain to any real success or financial freedom, and shortly after he returned to living his life as an overzealous Melvins fanboy that was too weak to actually carry around any equipment during their tours. Although I've made it seem like Cobain's relationship with Melvins was very one-sided for unfunny comedic value, this actually isn't the case. Buzz and Dale saw Cobain as an extremely likable guy and a friend they could trust with anything. The three developed a dark sense of humour that perhaps inspired much of Nirvana's more edgy later material. Other than Osborne and Crover, who were already in a band, Cobain found it difficult to meet people who were into music in the same way he was, instead parasitically attaching himself to Melvins, regularly hanging out at their practice space. It would be here that Cobain met eventual Nirvana bassist Chris Novoselic, leading to them occasionally rehearsing together. This resulted in a 6-month tirade from Cobain, who would persistently nag Novoselic to form a band together. After multiple months, Novoselic would eventually begrudgingly agree. Nirvana's early tours were pretty abysmal. No one really cared enough to turn up to shows, meaning the band had barely enough money to support themselves. This, combined with their inability to find a drummer and the fact they were battling a lawsuit with an English band over the usage of the name Nirvana, dampened the band's spirits. Maybe they should have stuck with one of their earlier names Skid Row, although I'm not sure the Hollywood romanticism Nirvana would eventually receive would have worked if the band were named after the dark reality of Los Angeles. The group used various drummers, including Dale Crover for some early EPs and shows, and Chad Channing, who would record on Bleach and eventually be fired by Cobain. I'd assume, based off the name alone, it was because he was viciously mogging Cobain at every performance. All the band needed was a suitable drummer. This would eventually come in the form of Dave Grohl. Grohl had been friends with Melvins for a few years, although was unaware of Cobain and Novoselic at the time. Grohl had played in the hardcore band Scream for a year or so, with Osbourne becoming a big fan of the band and attending many of their shows before Grohl had even joined that band. As a result of this, he would eventually befriend Grohl, and even took Novoselic and Cobain to a Scream show 3 years before the release of Nevermind. Scream would break up in 1990, leaving Grohl without a band. Unsure on what to do, he approached Buzz Osbourne for advice. Osbourne would tell Grohl that there was a band called Nirvana that were looking for a drummer. Grohl would travel to Seattle to audition shortly after. Based on the album material he had seen, he assumed Cobain and Novoselic were hulking, terrifying individuals akin to lumberjacks. When he was presented with a tall, goofy-looking motherfucker and a short, Urban Outfitters model-looking motherfucker, he was confused to say the least. Regardless, he still auditioned to his best ability and ended up joining the band, just in time for the production of their next album, Nevermind. Although Nirvana were relatively small at the time, the production of Nevermind received a decent buzz throughout the local scene. People could tell the album was going to perform well, although what actually ended up happening exceeded all expectations and changed the landscape of music forever. Shortly after the release of Nevermind, the album's lead single, Smells Like Teen Spirit, and accompanying music video would be picked up by MTV and consistently played to a mainstream audience. This led to a huge boost in airplay on the radio, attracting countless new fans. Their next tour would be dangerously oversold as a result, with television crews becoming a consistent presence on stage. Nirvana's label expected Nevermind to sell 250,000 copies overall. By the end of the year, it was selling 400,000 copies a week. Label executives were frothing at the mouth at the thought of all this tasty money, which catapulted what the industry labeled as grunge towards the mainstream. Contemporary Seattle-based bands such as Soundgarden, Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains began seeing a similar level of success, with the grunge gold rush even extending outside of just Seattle. Every label wanted the next Nirvana. Nevermind had stamped the beginning of a new generation and culture, with Cobain being reluctantly anointed the spokesperson. Every celebrity-based news publication was being flooded with images of Cobain wearing Butters glasses and having a severe inability to bathe. It's as if Cobain was the messiah of counterculture, a fact that he began to resent. He felt as if his message was being misinterpreted. Nobody paid attention to the band's political statements and instead just dribbled over the sight of a blonde man in a stripy jumper and funny glasses that would occasionally wear a dress and sing what they saw as nonsensical lyricism. The pressure began to weigh on Cobain, resulting in worsened addiction. Kurt Cobain had struggled with addiction throughout most of his adult life. Even before the success of Nirvana, he was described by bandmates as a junkie and consistently utilized substances like trippy whippy paper, although pretty much used anything he could get his hands on, eventually trying poppy seed injection device for the first time in 1986. By the time Nirvana was seeing worldwide success, Cobain had developed a fully fledged poppy seed addiction. At the time, he claimed his usage was to dull the immense lifelong stomach pain he had felt as a result of bronchitis and an undiagnosed stomach issue, although Buzz Osbourne disagrees with this statement, claiming how his stomach issues were as a result of the poppy seeds as opposed to the other way around. Regardless of his demons, his influence upon culture only grew, which in turn meant that all of his favourite bands would receive large amounts of label attention. Perhaps the most unusual example would be Butthole Surfers, and of course Melvins, as Cobain had been an overzealous fan for years. Melvins signed to Atlantic Records in 1993, and unlike most other underground signings at the time, managed to wriggle themselves into full creative control for the production of one album. The band were fully aware of the reality of the grunge explosion, and therefore were very skeptical of the deal. They knew much of Nirvana's worldwide success was due to the way in which Cobain looked and the image he portrayed. They felt as if their image would only turn away the fans that were beginning to idolize Cobain. Despite this, the label saw dollar signs in what was essentially Cobain's favorite band, resulting resulting in the A&R rep at Atlantic suggesting Melvins work alongside Cobain for the production of their major label debut Houdini. Cobain was of course happy to accept. He had been a die-hard fan for years and was still ripping off Melvins even in 1993, case in point Milk It. What by many was seen as a dream collaboration turned into a disaster. Cobain was barely able to look after himself, let alone work on multiple albums at once. It became clear very quickly to Osbourne that Cobain was unable to pull his weight. Osbourne wished to distance himself from Cobain's drug problems as much as possible, although was wholly against the full depravity of the situation making its way to the press. The final straw would be when Cobain failed to show up to a recording session. It became very obvious Cobain wasn't fit to help with the creation of the record, and considering it was Melvin's major label debut, they wanted it to be as good as possible. Osbourne stormed the office of the Nirvana manager and A&R rep, essentially just telling him that he had fired Cobain from the project. Although Cobain was removed from the project, label reps are greedy. They had such a desperate need to slap Cobain's name on literally anything that they were intended to sell that they even flat out lied to protect his image. When word got out that Cobain had been fired by Osbourne, the label went into full damage control, spinning the story in a way that would reflect Cobain in the best way possible. They claimed that Melvins specifically requested Cobain to help them write the songs, which has been refuted by Buzz, who claims himself a songwriting machine, and to be fair, Buzz Osbourne is a stubborn motherfucker. I highly doubt he'd let anyone write for him, so I tend to side with him in regards to this situation. They continued to double down, claiming that Cobain simply didn't have enough time to work on the album and left by his own accord. They were desperate to hide the dark reality of Cobain's addiction. Despite this, the downward spiral became obvious to the world during Nirvana's final tour in 1994. Melvins would open for Nirvana and described how the band often played absolutely terribly as a result of Cobain's worsening drug issues. During Nirvana's last ever concert in Munich, Germany, Cobain was having a monumental argument with his wife, Courtney Love, over the phone. He would turn to Osbourne for advice. Osbourne told Cobain to give Courtney Love whatever she wanted, get off the drugs and start from scratch, even if it meant solo touring with an acoustic guitar. It's a better situation than right now. It was clear to Osbourne that Cobain hated the position he was in, although was too weak as a result of drug use to make the correct decisions in order to leave that position. Everyone around him was leeching off of his success, draining every last drop. The last thing Cobain said to Osbourne was, "I should be doing this completely solo." Unfortunately, we all know what happens next. Just over a month after the Munich show, Cobain was found dead in his home by Regardless of your thoughts and opinions of the events surrounding his death, what can't be denied is the shockwave Cobain's death sent across the world. Not only did we lose a talented musician and cultural icon that day, but a close friend to many within the music scene. Unfortunately, much like most artist deaths, it resulted in a huge increase in sales, which just persuades individuals within the music business who only care about an increased number in their bank account to focus on romanticizing the death to make as much money as possible. It still happens to this day with modern artists, and it can even be argued that Cobain's death is still heavily romanticized, with every aspect of his life being sold, including clothing, guitars, his fucking journal. Melvins intended to fight back against what they perceived as romanticization shortly after his death. Specifically, Buzz Osbourne was surprisingly derogatory to Cobain, referring to him as a junkie and a prick. They described how his death wasn't going to stop them from making fun of him in the same way they would have when he was alive, which makes sense when exploring the dark humor they shared as childhood friends. Melvins ended up releasing 2 more albums with Atlantic in the following years, and since then have been one of the most productive rock bands in the history of music. In more recent interviews, the band have been more sensitive when discussing Cobain, describing how they'd give away their success and would prefer if the grunge explosion had never happened if it meant Cobain was still alive. It seems like they are still torn up about Cobain's death, which obviously isn't helped by the media's continued obsession with Cobain and Nirvana. Melvins knew Cobain for who he really was, years before he became the most famous face on the planet. It must be incredibly difficult to have a close friend's death be brought up by literally every interviewer on the planet. Melvins still release music to this day, with Cobain's involvement just being a small blip in the 27 album career of Melvins.